Hi, Josh. I am delighted that you agreed to join me in this conversation. You and I have been talking for over a decade. You were a union organizer when at college at Yale, and your career as a journalist covering labor and work has blossomed. You report so insightfully and have learned so much directly from workers, especially young workers, and what's happening in workplaces all over the country. From low wage to high tech. And also you report on the range of dynamic activism going on. You've been following labor policy, especially at the NLRB during different administrations, and you follow what's going on in some state houses around the country. You understand the legal issues like a lawyer, and I always learn from talking with you. I now observe all of this from a distance. No longer as a policymaker, but with the perspective of a long career in labor law and labor relations. First as an advocate, then in government. I see what's going on today with both dread and frustration. Dread about the divides, the hate, the violence, the pain and despair, democratic norms eroding, and democratic institutions under stress. But also with fascination about this historic moment of dynamism in both thought and action, not really seen in a century. I thought that a conversation from our different and across generation vantage points might be of interest to our audience and fun, at least for us. So thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me, Wilma. I have learned a tremendous amount from you over the past decade, and it's a joy to get to have conversations like this, and an honor to be part of this one.
Thank you. So shall we proceed with our conversation?
Please.
You want to start?
Sure. So as you mentioned, your career stretches throughout government and outside of government and a slew of organizations, and you found a way, including since leaving the board, to be involved in some of the most interesting things happening in the workplace. I wonder, to start with, about your experience working on models that are alternatives, like this effort to have a works council with a union at Volkswagen, more recently your work on employee ownership. Have those shifted your perspective from how you saw things when you were at the board? Do you see those as an alternative to NLRA unionism or as something else?
Well, I have been lucky in my post-NLRB life, and it is true that up until then, my focus had been on traditional labor law, both as a union lawyer and during my nearly 14 years as a member, then chair of the NLRB. Since then, my focus has been on some really interesting kind of projects which push the boundaries of traditional labor law, or things that are occurring notwithstanding the law and its limits. You mentioned two things. About maybe 8-9 years ago, I was asked by the United Auto Workers to work with them when they were engaged in an organizing campaign at the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they were interested and in dialogue with Volkswagen about trying to set up a German-style works council if they were successful in organizing the plant. They consulted me because they wanted to know whether there was a chance that Volkswagen could set up a works council on its own, absent union representation. And my conclusion was that under existing labor law, Volkswagen could not do that. But unfortunately, the organizing campaign did not succeed. There was a lot of outside interference by various politicians in the state. There was a second election, which the union also won also lost more narrowly than the first. But so far, this experiment hasn't occurred. But I would say that the attempt by the United Auto Workers in dialogue with Volkswagen at the time sparked a lot of interest and probably a renewed interest in the German model of co-determination with its enterprise level works councils and worker representation on supervisory boards, along with, in the dual model, along with the unions themselves, negotiating with companies and across sectors, the economic pieces of the relationship. There has been a lot of interest in this, but so far it hasn't occurred. More recently, I've also, as you mentioned, been involved in some efforts at worker ownership. I first became knowledgeable about these things when I spent a few years at Rutgers and learned from their experts in worker ownership. More recently, I've been asked to sit on a board of a brand new nonprofit called Ownership Works, which is trying to promote worker equity shares through private equity deals. So I would say about both of these, what's most interesting to me is, and this relates to something else I've done post NLRB, I was asked a few years ago on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the International Labor Organization to write a paper for a conference that was held in Paris on industrial democracy. Or the labor question that people were talking about a century ago. And the labor question was, the answer to the labor question was widely said to be industrial democracy. But what industrial democracy meant was subject to great interpretation amongst different aspects of labor and social movements, some more radical than others, and amongst employers themselves who talked about industrial democracy but had their own ideas about what it meant. They were hoping, of course, to have some kind of industrial democracy short of independent labor unions or government intervention. But the range included collective bargaining, which the AFL unions promoted. Some, like the Knights of Labor and other groups, promoted worker ownership. Employers, for their part, were instituting employee representation plans, works council type entities. During the First World War, the government did intervene to try to maintain labor peace, and shop committees were set up in industries all over the nation. Unions thought that even though these were non-union, there was some hope that they would turn into union represented organizations. That wasn't to happen. At the end of the First World War, the government retrenched. There was repression by government and by employers of labor. During the 20s, the welfare capitalism model took hold, and employers once again instituted a variety of different kind of worker councils, representation plans, profit sharing, et cetera. But those worker councils, works like the German works councils, were eventually outlawed by the 1935 Wagner Act, which adopted the collective bargaining model as our nation's vision of industrial democracy. And that is what prevails in the law today. So these other things are, and essentially, I think, an attempt, particularly in recent years, to reimagine different earlier forms of industrial democracy. And that's the piece that I find so exciting.
Speaking of this moment that we're in, you referenced, I think, this upsurge that we're seeing around the country in organizing in unexpected places at some of the most prominent, most powerful companies in the United States. It might have seemed safe a few years ago to assume that a labor board vote at a Starbucks cafe or an Amazon warehouse would, at best for the labor movement, seem like a moral victory, a noble failure, but we've now actually seen certified victories at both companies. How big a deal is this long-term? And particularly, how significant can the impact of these kinds of wins be in the absence of federal labor law reform? Is there still a catch-22 between an upsurge in worker organizing and a transformation of the labor law, or has that catch-22 somehow been blown up by some of these victories we've been seeing recently?
So that's a multi-part question. So where do I begin? And let me just say, let me start with a piece of your first question that I didn't answer, whether I see these other things as alternatives to traditional labor unions. I do not see them as alternatives. I see them as complementary. I think we have a very complex economy, and I think there's room for a lot of different forms of worker voice, worker engagement, worker power. And I think that's what's most interesting about this moment. There is a dynamism of both activism and intellectual thought that we really haven't seen perhaps in 100 years. Certainly this worker activism, which we've seen accelerated, is remarkable. It's really an historic moment. I think it began about 10 years ago, first with Occupy Wall Street, then with the Fight for 15, which started small in New York City and now has grown all over the country and in fact globally. But I think certainly this activism has really been accelerated during the pandemic with the intersecting crises, both of the virus, the attendant economic consequences, the racial justice crisis, the climate crisis, the democracy crisis. All of these intersecting and cascading crises, I think, have led to a growing awareness by lots of people, particularly workers, of the inadequacies of our social contract, of the weakness of our social safety net, of the fact that workers have become terribly disempowered. They've lost a voice. And the tremendous discontent and frustration that has bubbled up. We've seen this not only with the so-called Great Resignation, with people leaving jobs and moving to other jobs, but in the demands for higher wages. Some of that, of course, is a result of the Fight for 15, which didn't result in widespread unionization, but did result in minimum wage hikes all over the country. So I think what we are seeing is a very complex kind of thing. The worker organizing that we see is both with traditional unions and with startup organizations like the Amazon win in Staten Island. But even the year before, the loss at the Amazon Bessemer plant, I think, was significant. Obviously, there's nothing like winning. And winning is contagious, as we're seeing at Starbucks. But the attention that got, both by the media, and I have to footnote here, Josh, that I think reporters like you and other labor reporters who are covering these workplace stories are really a major factor in the growing awareness of the public of the needs of workers. 10 years ago, you didn't see the newspapers and the media plastered with stories about what's going on in the workplace. So I think we're seeing all different kinds of worker organizing, some of it, again, with the goal of collective bargaining, some of it not yet. But this is something that people ignore at their peril, especially the corporate world. So, I forgot to answer your question about labor law reform, and is this a catch-22?
Well, compound questions are hopefully more allowable here than in an administrative law judge hearing.
Well, I think this is all happening without labor law reform. And I have always thought that labor law reform would happen only with a reinvigorated worker movement or labor movement. And so, I think it's going to go that direction rather than vice versa. It's a catch-22 in the sense that labor law reform would presumably also catalyze more union organizing. But I don't think, given our deep partisan divides and our deep divides on these kinds of issues, and not to mention the war on government that is so powerful in our country, I don't think that we will see significant labor law reform absent sustained, powerful worker activism.
I want to turn to the role of your old home, the NLRB, in all of this. Right now, following President Biden's appointments, we have a general counsel who's taken an unusually ambitious approach to trying to change precedent, not only from Trump, but going back to Eisenhower and presidents in between. We have a Democratic majority who signaled they take a broader view of what the act protects. What do you expect we will see by the time the Republicans again are back in power and able to replace these folks? What do you think can or should get done?
Well, that depends on when the Republicans come back in power, if they come back in power. But what we are seeing, obviously, and you've written about this a lot, is a very aggressive, ambitious general counsel. Some of it is a result of the profound and sweeping precedent changes during the Trump administration. Some of it, I think, is occasioned by what we just talked about, the amazing activism and dynamism going on in workplaces. And also a younger generation of workers, with all that represents, both the diversity, changing needs and demands, a desire for a voice. Yeah, they want economic improvements, but they also want a voice. They want dignity in the workplace, as far as I can tell. So I think the dynamics of the younger workers, and I'd be interested in your perspectives on this, because you talk to a lot of them, I know, but I think that is really making for some interesting cases coming before the NLRB. So far, the board itself has not issued any of the precedent-setting cases. They have had a lot thrown at them, not to mention undoing some of the rulemaking that the Trump board engaged in. Rulemaking is very time-consuming and labor-intensive. But what I think is for sure is what we will see coming out of this board is a much more dynamic, living view of the law than we've seen certainly during the Trump administration. When I talk about living law, that's a Louis Brandeis notion of keeping the law alive. Of course, the board has to act within the constraints of this aging statute. Not really amended since 1947. They have to act within the constraints of decades of precedent that they have to navigate, and they have to act mindful of a very skeptical and hostile judiciary, even more so as a result of the Trump appointments. I think any board committed to a dynamic interpretation of the law can make very meaningful change, but somewhat modest. They can't make radical change without statutory change. And the board, of course, is known for flip-flopping or policy oscillation. We'll see that again, absent any kind of real statutory change. But few areas of the law, I'm sure they will make some noticeable rulings, and those would cover the coverage issues, who's an employee, who's an employer, always vexing issues, and issues that sometimes flip-flop. And that has included the issue of graduate teaching assistants, for example, not to mention who's an employee, who's an independent contractor. With remedies, the labor law has famously weak remedies. I'm sure they will do their best to, within the constraints of the law, try to impose meaningful remedies. And then perhaps some of the most interesting cases come within the issues of the scope of concerted activity protected by the law. Workers, again, are pushing, I think, the boundaries of what the board has considered to be within the scope of protected concerted activity. I think we'll see some interesting decisions. I think you've been covering one interesting trial that maybe we could talk about. And then last, I think the board certainly will make some rulings or rulemakings with respect to NLRB election procedures and the oversight of permissible campaign interference.
It's interesting. Again, this also goes to this industrial democracy question that you raised at the beginning. I was surprised reading one of Nelson Lichtenstein's books a while ago to learn just how common that was in US mainstream political discourse a century ago, in a way it isn't now. And it's been interesting for me traveling around the country, talking to Starbucks workers to see what a theme of the campaign, democracy and having a voice in the workplace, has been. That many of these workers have been insistent that there is no particular issue or even set of issues that the company could resolve that would sufficiently mitigate their sense that they need a seat at the table. And they point frequently to Starbucks' invocation of an empty chair that's at the table representing them. And now they're in collective bargaining, trying to negotiate an actual seat in that actual chair with the company. I know we're almost out of time. I do wonder, when we talk about the board, now that you have the perspective of these years since leaving, are there particular issues that you wish you had been able to tackle more while you were there, or approach in a different way?
Well, the coverage issues always interested me, because I was quite struck during my time at the board how ingenious the business world was in the way they structured their operations, and particularly the way they arranged for work to be done. And that often led to issues of whether they were the employer of the workers in question, whether they had to bargain with them, whether they were joint employers, whether they were considered an alter ego or a single employer in the parlance of the law, whether the workers were independent contractors or their employees. I would have liked to have been able to decide some of those issues. I wrote dissenting opinions on some of those classification issues. The board, after I left, did issue some decisions. Those have been subsequently reversed by the Trump board. In fact, I have said to some of my colleagues that I felt a little bit canceled in some of the decisions, but I spent 8 years in the minority during the Bush years. And I have to say that perhaps what I am most attached to and maybe most proud of is the body of dissenting opinions, because even if the majority opinions get overruled, the dissents are still out there and still can migrate to a majority position at some time in the future. But I wanted to comment, Josh, also about democracy and political democracy, because that was a theme 100 years ago, that and this was a Brandeis notion as well, that you couldn't really have political democracy without democracy in the workplace. And one of the notion of the labor question, which people say has arisen again in this new Gilded Era, the notion of the labor question was that there was a gap between the promise of democracy or the American dream and the grim realities of life for so many people, for so many working people. And so I think these issues are as real today as they were 100 years ago. As we are seeing the erosion of some democratic institutions, I think these issues are even as important as they have ever been. And I think workers do realize that. There are also a couple of bills that have been introduced into Congress that would mandate a worker representation on corporate boards. I think, as I said earlier, this is part of the German model of co-determination that has fascinated some people. I don't think we can just simply export the German model into our society, but I think, and this is what I tried to say at the beginning, I think we need to be open-minded to new approaches. To not in place of traditional unionism or collective bargaining by any means, but to perhaps open up the dialogue, to engage more. One of the things that I think is most sad is the lack of any kind of meaningful dialogue between labor, business, and government. But they have that in Europe. That's the so-called social dialogue, or the social partners. That I think is sorely missing from our climate. And I would like to hope that this historic moment will lead to some more opening up of that dialogue. Whether it's going to be a transformational moment in terms of profound change and improvement, I guess remains to be seen. It will require, I think, a lot of public attention, a lot of writing by you about these issues, you and your colleagues, an opening up of the business world, some courageous business leaders who are willing to say we need a new approach. We can't just have this traditional knee-jerk anti-unionism. And I think that business world has to do that they, at their peril, will if they ignore the alienation, the frustration, the voicelessness, the powerlessness of workers. We are seeing the results of that in many respects right now.
Thank you. I think we're about to be out of time, and you've summed it up very well. I really appreciate your inviting me to have this conversation, and let's keep it going for the months and years ahead.
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate your willingness to do this with me. I wish we had a little more time, because I know you have lots of things you could share with us, but I know you're going to continue writing, and your voice will be out there for a long time to come. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much.